Welcome. I'm John. Bordeaux has 170 years of classification. Burgundy has monks and Grand Cru vineyards. Champagne has centuries of tradition. California has a guy who planted a vineyard in the 1960s because he thought Napa Valley could rival the best in the world. And most people thought he was crazy. Here's what makes collecting California different from everything we've covered so far. There's no 1855 classification. There's no Grand Cru system. There's not centuries of rankings to lean on. What you have instead is a handful of producers with tiny production, massive demand, and mailing lists you can't get on. The cult wine phenomenon that drives today's collector's market really only started in the late 1980s and 90s. And that means the rules are still being written. And that creates both opportunity and risk for collectors. This video covers how the California cult wine market works, the history, the key names, the regions beyond Napa, how allocations work, and how to start collecting without getting burned. This one's personal for me. As an American collector, I've gotten allocations from many of these producers. It takes time, it takes knowledge, but it is doable. So, let's get into it. Wine has been made in California since the 1700s. The Spanish missions planted vineyards all the way up the coast. But modern California wine really started after Prohibition. The industry rebuilt slowly through the 40s, 50s, 60s. It was good wine, but nobody was comparing it to Bordeaux, and nobody was really collecting it. That is, until Robert Mondavi changed everything. In 1965, Mondavi was running Charles Krug, which is Napa's oldest winery. It was founded in 1861 by a Prussian immigrant. The Mondavi family bought the property in 1943, and for 2 decades, Robert and his brother Peter ran it together. Until a family feud that literally involved a fist fight. Robert was pushed out. And so he opened his own place in Oakville in 1966, and the rest is history. By the way, this is a quick aside for those who watched the Champagne episode. Charles Krug, the Napa winery, has nothing to do with Krug, the Champagne house. They're totally different Krugs. Johann Joseph Krug founded the Champagne house in Reims in 1843. Charles Krug founded the winery in St. Helena in 1861. There's no relation. But if you're building a collection, you might end up with both Krugs in your cellar for completely different reasons. Okay, back to Mondavi. His genius, it wasn't just winemaking, it was positioning. He was the first person to market California wine as a lifestyle, culture, something that belonged on the world stage. And it was that mind shift that made everything else possible. Let's talk about the Judgment of Paris, 1976. Now, a British wine merchant named Stephen Spurrier organized a blind tasting in Paris. French judges, the best France versus the best of California. Stag's Leap wine cellars won for Cabernet, Chateau Montelena won for Chardonnay, and the French judges, they had picked California wines over their own. They didn't know it. And here's what detail that made this happen in the wine world. There was one journalist there, and only one, George Tabor. He was the Paris correspondent for Time magazine. Every other reporter had turned down the invitation, why bother? Everybody knew the French would win. And so Tabor wrote a quick 4 paragraphs. And at the time, Time had a readership of 20 million people. And that little piece, which has been called the most significant news story ever written about wine, set off a chain reaction. So Americans rushed to wine shops looking for those California bottles that nobody had ever heard of. And some of the French judges apparently were asked to resign from their positions inside the French wine community. But if Tabor hadn't shown up, the French might have just denied the results. The whole thing would have been forgotten. It never would have been reported on. And so California wine owes an enormous debt to a journalist who almost didn't bother going at all. Let's talk about the cult era. In the late 1980s into the 90s, a new generation of winemakers started making tiny production, ultra-premium wines. And they weren't trying to be Bordeaux anymore. They were unapologetically California. They were big wines, ripe wines, concentrated flavors, and expensive. And at the same time, Robert Parker came along with his 100-point scale and started giving those wines perfect scores. A Parker 100 could double a wine's value overnight. Genuine scarcity plus critical acclaim plus Parker's influence created a secondary market almost overnight. And the names that launched it? Screaming Eagle, first vintage, 1992. Jean Phillips, a few hundred cases from a small plot in Oakville, and Parker gave the 92 a 99, and the 1997 got 100 points, and a single bottle sold at auction for $500,000. This is ground zero for California cult wine. Harlan Estate, founded in 1984, first released 1990. Bill Harlan's vision was explicit, create a California-first growth, and he deliberately modeled it on the best of Bordeaux. Harlan, then Bond, then Promontory, he built an empire. Dalle Valle and Maya in 1988. Nyoka Dalle Valle, Maya became one of the first California wines to command first growth prices. Colgan, 1992, and Colgan, tiny production, immediate critical acclaim. Bryant Family, 1992, first vintage. Pritchard Hill, Parker gave that second vintage 100 points. Now, if you're going to start collecting California, here's your map. I'm kind of breaking this into tiers, and I'm not breaking into tiers by quality, but by accessibility. Like, how hard is it to actually get the wine? Tier 1, these are like really hard to get. Screaming Eagle, around 500 cases a year. The defining California cult wine. This is like $3,000 or more on the secondary market, and this wait list is years long. Harlan Estates. This is Bill Harlan's original. It's consistently one of the highest rated cabs in California, plus Bond, 5 single vineyard wines, and Promontory. These actually share a mailing list ecosystem, so getting on one can help with the other. Scarecrow. This is the old J.J. Cohn vineyard in Rutherford. There's a Wizard of Oz connection with the name, and Brett Lopez makes about 700 cases. It's a beautiful wine. It is impossible to find. Colgan, multiple bottling. There's Nine Estate, Tyson Hill, Kyriad. And Colgan, it's got impeccable consistency across decades. Let's talk about Tier 2. This is your serious collector wines. 100 Acre, Jason Woodbridge, multiple vineyards, known for massive concentration. Parker loved these wines. There's not a lot of subtlety here, but they are the consistent win at my parties. It is a force in the collector market. Realm. This brand actually nearly went bankrupt twice. They lost their entire second vintage to a warehouse arson fire, then teetered on the edge before Scott Becker, a Harvard MBA who worked for Bill Harlan, acquired in 2012 and restructured the finances. Every wine is named after Shakespeare, so they got the Bard, Tempest, Absurd, Falstaff, and it's taken from the line in Richard II, this blessed plot, this earth, this realm. These labels are also original art pieces, and Parker's 2 perfect 10s on the 2012 vintage saved the brand overnight. Kopshandy, Robbie and Lou Kopshandy. State Lane Vineyard in Yountville. This is a Hungarian immigrant family. The state wine is exceptional. It's getting harder and harder to find. David Abreu. Abreu is the most famous vineyard manager in Napa, and he manages land for Harlan, Colgan, and others. And his wines are very tiny production, and they're very collectible. Sine Qua Non. This is actually Central Coast, so it's not Napa. Manfred Krankel. Every vintage gets a different name and a different label. He works with Rhone varieties, Syrah, Grenache, not Cabernet. But this cult following is as intense as anything in Napa. Let's talk about Tier 3, the collectible, but more accessible. Opus 1. This is the Mondavi-Rothschild collaboration. The most famous Napa wine globally. This is not as hard to find as cult names, but it commands respect and it ages well. This is a great first collector bottle from California. Joseph Phelps Insignia. This is one of the original Bordeaux-style blends from Napa, decades of track record, and it's consistent. Ridge Montebello in Santa Cruz Mountains. This is also not Napa, but I'm going to argue that this is actually the very best value and collectible California wine. This is Paul Draper's legacy, and it's one of those wines that won the 30-year rematch of the Judgment in Paris in 2006. It ages beautifully, and you could still find it. Dominus. This is Christian Mouet, the person behind Petrus, and he's making wine in Napanook Vineyard in Yountville. He's got the Bordeaux Prestige. It's got California fruit. It's a serious collector wine. It's not quite getting the hype it deserves. Dunn Vineyard, Howell Mountain, is an old school tannic built to age 30 plus years. It's kind of like an anti-cult wine. It's not flashy, but it's one of those you could just put away. Palmas family. This is one of the most technically advanced operations in Napa. The cave system they built in the hillside is extraordinary and it's worth visiting. Camus, Special Selection, the Wagner family. There's more of this available than most of the cult names, but it's got a collector pedigree and a long track record. But California is not just Napa Cabernet. The Sonoma Coast for Pinot Noir and Chardonnay. Literori, Hirsch, Marcassan, Flowers. It's different game entirely, but collector worthy. Santa Barbara, Santa Rita. They have Pinot, Chardonnay again, Sandy, Domaine de Coty. This is Rajat Par's project, Sea Smoke. There's a growing collector interest in it. Paso Robles, Rhone Varietals, Tables Creek, a partnership with the Perrin family from Chateauneuf du Pape, Saxum, La Venture. This region is like really heating up. So the Santa Cruz Mountains, Ridge Montebello lives here, also Mount Eden. Do not sleep on this region. Here's what you need to know. The allocation system. This is the single biggest thing that new collectors need to understand about California. It's just completely different from how you buy Bordeaux or Burgundy. California cult wines sell direct to consumers through mailing lists. So you sign up, you wait, sometimes years, and eventually you get offered a few bottles at release price. Now, if you turn down this allocation, you might lose your spot. But this system is creating like scarcity, and it's fueling the entire secondary market. And so how do you get on these special secret lists? Well, one way is to visit the winery, join during your visit. Some give priority for people who show up in person. But just go onto the website and wait. And you can buy other wines from the same portfolio sometimes. So like, as I mentioned, Harlan, Bond, Promontory, they have a list ecosystem. Also, network, because collectors share leads. In building relationship with retailers who carry allocated wine matters. Or just go into the secondary market, auction houses and wine exchange. And sometimes you're going to pay multiples, though, of that release price. This mailing list concept is super American. Bordeaux, wines are sold through a negociant system to merchants worldwide. In Burgundy, allocations go through the importers and retailers. But in California, the winery sells to you. This means two things. One is the winery is capturing the full margin, and this is part of the reason they charge what they charge. Then the consumer also has a direct relationship with the producer, and that's kind of why the visits matter. It also means that secondary market markup can be enormous, and the gap between release price and resale price, that's where speculation lives. Let's talk about the Parker effect and kind of what's changing. Robert Parker and his 100-point scores created this market. A perfect score would double that wine's price. Now, Parker retired from reviewing California in the mid-2010s, and the influence of individual critics has begun to fragment. Jeb Dunnick, Antonio Galloni at Vineyards, current wine advocate reviewers, they all carry weight, but it isn't dominating like Parker once did. So for collectors, this is an opportunity. The wines that don't get a headline score can be undervalued, so pay attention to the wine itself, not just a number. Aging potential. California cult cabs are often criticized for not aging as well as Bordeaux. There is some truth to that. Many are made in a very ripe, approachable style that's big and bold and delicious on release. But the best of them absolutely can age. Harlan and Dominus and Ridge Montebello and Dunn. These wines have 30-year track records, and they are incredible if you get an early vintage. The key is knowing which producers make wine that are built for time versus those for immediate impact. And not every single wine with a high score and high price rewards that patience. Style wars. There's a real divide in California right now between the big, rich, high-alcohol cabs, this Parker-era style, and more restrained, low-alcohol, site-driven wines that the new generation of winemakers is pursuing. If you watch the Italy episode, this is like California's version of the Barolo Wars. Now, neither camp is right. It's just you need to know that they age differently and the market values them differently. If you're acting as a collector, understand both what you know and what you prefer. Drink broadly before you go deep and invest. California cult wines have a huge domestic demand. It's very strong. But the international liquidity is much less than Bordeaux or Burgundy. A bottle of Screaming Eagle is easy to sell in the US, but it's harder to move in London or Hong Kong. Now, that being said, this domestic market is very deep, and those prices for the top names have been super stable. Let's talk about these price tiers. Entry-level collectibles are still about $75 to $150 a bottle. Opus 1 from older vintages, Ridge Montebello, Insignia, Dun Vineyards. These have real track records at prices that won't break you. In the mid-range, about $150 to $400. Dominus, Ovid, Sine Qua Non on release. These are serious wines. All right, now we get to serious. So this is $400, $1,500 a bottle. Harlan, Colgan, Bond, Scarecrow on release. This is like first growth Bordeaux territory. These are trophies. True trophy, the Screaming Eagles, the Harlan back vintages, the Scarecrow secondary market. This is kind of the deep end. The question is, are some of these overpriced? Of course. The secondary market for certain producers has gotten way ahead of the actual drinking experience. But the truly great producers, the ones with track records across multiple decades, have held value consistently. The risk is in the newer producers with big scores and no long-term track record. So be really careful chasing the hype. Do you need this? No, absolutely not. There's actually an argument that California is where the most interesting discoveries are happening right now, but it's really because the hierarchy isn't set in stone. This is the smart approach if you're getting started. Start with the wines that have this long track records. Ridge and Montebello, you're done. Your Insignia, your Opus 1. That way you kind of have a foundation and you could just cellar these with confidence because they've been proven over decades. And then get on the mailing list now for wines that you're curious about. Even if that wait is years, your future self will thank you. It costs nothing to sign up and you're not obligated once your time comes. And then start exploring beyond Napa. So you have Sonoma, Santa Barbara, Paso Robles. These regions offer collector quality wines at a fraction of Napa prices, and that quality gap is actually closing. And finally, just don't chase scores. Drink broadly, find what you love, then go deep. I say this like in every one of the videos because it's really important advice. But here's the California advantage that people don't talk about. Unlike Burgundy, where you may never get your allocation of DRC, or Bordeaux, where you're competing with global demand, California wines are available direct from the winery, and you can visit, and you can meet the winemakers, and you could build a personal relationship with the producers. That access is just something you cannot get in Europe, so use it. Where do collectors buy California wine? Typically, direct from wineries through mailing lists and tasting room purchases. That's your primary channel. But then there's some retailers with allocated inventory. K&L Wines and Benchmark and Wine.com have some producers. And then you could go to auction houses for back vintages, Acker and Hart Davis Hart and Sotheby's. Or you could go to wine exchanges and you could look at Vinfolio, Cellar Tracker Marketplace. But go to your local wine shop and just ask. You might be very surprised. Storage. This is like a super interesting California thing. A lot of the California wine ship during the summer. And if you're getting wine delivered in July, you are going to want to request cold shipping or ask them to hold it till fall because the heat damage is irreversible. Professional storage, just as important for California wine as the European, and don't let anybody tell you otherwise. California wines in original wooden cases are less common than in Bordeaux. A lot of times they ship in cardboard, and that matters a lot less for drinking, but it still matters for resale. It's just worth knowing. Always the case for collection. Keep your documentation, your receipts, your storage records, your provenance trail. California provenance documentation tends to be thinner than European, where the chain of custody is documented. So the more you can prove, the better off you're going to be. So if Bordeaux is tradition, Burgundy is terroir, and Champagne is celebration, California is ambition. These wines exist because people believe they can make something world-class in a place with no history of it, and they were right. That spirit, that audacity, is part of what you're collecting when you buy California. And here's what makes it different than everything else in your cellar. California is the youngest major wine region with collector-grade wines. This story is still being written. Some of the producers making the very best wine in California right now have only been at it for 10 or 15 years. That means there's room for discovery in a way that simply doesn't exist in Bordeaux or Burgundy. California collecting comes down to this. Know the difference between cult hype and genuine quality. Understand the mailing list game. Store properly. And remember, this market is younger and more dynamic than the European classic. This is both the risk and the opportunity. Start with those proven names, get on those lists, visit if you can. There's no substitute for tasting at the source. And remember, the best California wines aren't trying to be Bordeaux anymore. They're their own thing, and that's what makes them worth collecting. So drop a comment. Tell me what California wine first blew your mind and what you're trying to get allocated. Cheers.